I was running, not the dignified stride of a senior Cathari diplomat, not the measured pace that 30 years of galactic service had carved into my bones. I was running like a fresh academy graduate, chasing a shuttle departure, my robes tangling around my legs, my breath burning in my throat. Every emergency beacon on the diplomatic floor was flashing red and gold, and those beacons had not activated together since the Rathani border crisis 4 decades ago. I turned the corner and nearly collided with Ambassador Zeleth of the Valesi delegation, who was moving just as fast from the opposite direction, her 4 eyes wide, with something I had never seen on her face before. Fear. We reached the council amphitheater together and pushed through the massive doors into controlled pandemonium. Every seat was filled. Delegates who had not physically attended a session in years were present in the flesh, not by holographic proxy. The circular chamber echoed with 100 overlapping voices speaking in a dozen languages, and the translation systems were struggling to keep pace. I found my designated position in the Cathari section and activated my console, scanning for the source of the emergency. It took me exactly 4 seconds to find it. The Draxari Dominion had launched a full military assault on a human colony world called Meridian's Reach. 14 million civilians. The sensor data was still coming in, but early estimates showed at least 300 Draxari warships in the system, with more arriving through transit corridors every hour. The colony's orbital defense stations were engaged but overwhelmed. Ground reports were fragmentary and growing worse by the minute. Distress signals from the surface painted a picture of bombardment, landing operations, and civilian zones under direct fire. Residential districts in the colony's capital had taken orbital strikes. Emergency shelters were overcrowded. Medical facilities were running out of supplies. I sat down slowly, my hands gripping the edge of my console. Around me, the chaos continued, but my mind had gone quiet the way it always did when something truly dangerous was unfolding. I pulled up everything I knew about the parties involved and began assembling context, because context was the only tool I had. The Draxari Dominion was a 400-year-old military empire. Their entire civilization was built on conquest and the maintenance of conquered territory. They had subjugated 26 species across their centuries of expansion, absorbing some into their labor economy, marginalizing others into dependent client states, and outright crushing those who resisted too effectively. Their fleet was the largest in the sector, numbering over 15,000 warships of various classes. Their soldiers were bred for discipline and trained from adolescence. Their warlords governed with absolute authority, derived from a cultural tradition that equated military rank with moral worth. They were, by any objective measure, the most formidable conventional military power in the galactic community. Then there were the humans. Humanity had joined the galactic community 32 years ago, arriving with modesty that I now recognized might have been carefully calibrated. In that time, they had established themselves as shrewd traders, persistent diplomats, and surprisingly generous partners. They built hospitals on Cathari border worlds, where our own government could not afford to send medical teams. They shared agricultural technology with species that could not afford to develop their own, asking nothing in return except goodwill and the occasional cultural exchange. They ran student programs, scientific collaborations, joint expeditions into uncharted systems, and festivals celebrating the art and music of species they had known for only a few years. They were liked. More than liked, in many circles, they were genuinely admired for their warmth and their seemingly bottomless curiosity about other species. I had personal friendships with human diplomats. I had attended their holidays. I had laughed at their jokes and admired their persistence in learning the Cathari language, which most species considered impossibly difficult. But nobody had ever seen humans fight a real war, not at this scale. There had been skirmishes, brief exchanges with pirate fleets along their trade routes, a confrontation with a mercenary force near the Outer Rim that ended so quickly, most analysts dismissed it as an anomaly, attributing the speed to mercenary cowardice rather than human capability. The general consensus among the galactic military community was that humans were mid-tier at best. Competent enough to defend their borders against minor threats, certainly, but nothing that would keep a warlord awake at night. Their fleet, by the best available intelligence estimates, was roughly 1/3 the size of the Draxari Navy. Their weapons technology was assessed as standard. Their strategic doctrine was considered undeveloped. The amphitheater's central holographic display activated with a pulse of light, and the massive face of Warlord Krezek filled the chamber. He was broadcasting from his flagship, the geometrically brutal silhouette of his command vessel visible through the viewport behind him. Krezek was enormous, even by Draxari standards, his armored hide scarred from decades of personal combat, his eyes burning with the particular arrogance of someone who had never lost a fight and could not conceive of losing one. He addressed the council directly. His words were clipped and dismissive. The Meridian's reach system, he declared, fell within the Draxari ancestral territorial mandate, a claim based on pre-contact survey data that most historians considered dubious at best. This was a correction of historical boundaries, not an act of aggression. Any species that interfered would face consequences he described in vivid detail, drawing on examples from previous Draxari conquests that made several delegates visibly uncomfortable. He specifically singled out 3 species by name, reminding them of what had happened the last time someone had challenged Dominion sovereignty. 2 of those species no longer had independent militaries. The third had lost a third of its territory. It was not a speech, it was a declaration delivered from a position of overwhelming confidence, backed by 4 centuries of evidence that the confidence was justified. He ended by daring anyone in the chamber to dispute his claim, and the dare was not rhetorical. He meant it. In the silence that followed his transmission, I looked toward the human delegation. There were 5 of them. They occupied their seats in the 4th tier of the amphitheater, a modest position for a species of their influence. At their center sat Director Lena Hargrove, the senior human diplomatic representative to the council. She was a woman of perhaps 50 standard years, with steel-gray hair cut short and a face that seemed designed for patience. I had interacted with Hargrove on dozens of occasions over the previous 3 years. She was intelligent, measured, and had a talent for finding compromise positions that left all parties feeling heard. She had negotiated a mining rights agreement between the Cathari and the Rathani that both sides still cited as a model of fairness. She had never raised her voice in a council session. She had never needed to. What struck me was the stillness of the human delegation. Every other group in the amphitheater was in motion. Delegates were conferring urgently, messaging home governments, arguing with neighbors, pulling up military databases, and checking fleet positions. The humans sat in perfect calm, watching Krezek's broadcast the way someone might watch a weather report for a region they did not live in. No visible anger, no urgency, no panic, no frantic communication with their government, just attention, quiet, focused, absolute attention. When Krezek's transmission ended, Hargrove stood. She did not rush. She activated her console, requested the floor through proper protocol, and waited until the speaker acknowledged her. Then she walked to the central podium with the unhurried pace of someone approaching a routine trade negotiation, her footsteps the only sound in the amphitheater. She did not look at the other delegations. She did not appeal for alliance or support. She did not condemn the Draxari, or call for sanctions or invoke mutual defense provisions. She faced the display where Krezek's image had been, and read from a single prepared statement, her voice level, her enunciation precise, each word falling into the silence with the weight of something that had been composed very carefully and very far in advance. Warlord Krezek, the United Earth Coalition addresses you directly. You have 72 standard hours to withdraw all military forces from the Meridian's reach system. You will return all captured civilians unharmed. You will submit to reparations arbitration under Council Charter. If you do not comply fully with these terms within the stated period, there will be no further negotiation. There will be no ceasefire. There will be no treaty. There will be nothing left to negotiate with. She returned to her seat. The entire statement had taken less than 40 seconds. I replayed her words in my mind immediately, and then again, and then a third time. Something about the phrasing disturbed me deeply, though it took a moment to identify what. She had not said, "We will defend ourselves." She had not said, "We will retaliate." She had not threatened military action in any conventional sense. Nothing left to negotiate with. Not nothing left to negotiate about with. The preposition mattered. It changed the meaning from, "There will be no diplomatic outcome," to, "There will be no entity remaining on your side, capable of conducting diplomacy. It was not a threat of war. It was a threat of something that went beyond war, something that the word itself could not contain. Beside me, a Hadron military attaché leaned over and whispered, "What does she mean by that?" I did not have an answer. I was not sure I wanted one. The Draxari response came within the hour. Krezek appeared again, laughing openly. His officers gathered behind him, sharing the amusement. He called the human statement the bluster of a cornered herbivore. He invited any human fleet to meet his ships in open space, where he promised to demonstrate the difference between a civilization built for war and a civilization built for selling trinkets. He reminded the Council that the Dominion had been conquering star systems when humanity was still burning fossil fuels on a single planet. His mockery was thorough and creative. I could see that he genuinely believed what he was saying. The Draxari had never encountered a species they could not overwhelm through superior military force, and they had no reason to believe the humans would be different. The clock started. I spent the next 60 hours monitoring every intelligence feed available to my office. I watched the Draxari reinforce their position at Meridian's reach. More ships arrived from across the Dominion, summoned by Krezek to provide an overwhelming response to any human counterattack. Ground forces consolidated their hold on the colony's major population centers. Supply lines were established from Draxari logistics bases 3 systems away. Krezek was not simply occupying the system. He was digging in, building a defensive posture that dared the humans to come and try to take it back. He wanted the fight. He was eager for it. Everything about his deployment suggested a commander who viewed the coming battle as an opportunity to demonstrate Draxari superiority on a galactic stage. The humans did nothing visible in response. No fleet mobilization was detected by any intelligence service monitoring human space. No ships departed human territory. No communications were intercepted that suggested military coordination. No calls for Allied support were made. The human delegation remained at the Council Citadel, attending scheduled meetings on trade policy and agricultural exchange, as though nothing unusual was happening. Hargrove signed a cultural partnership agreement with the Cathari Arts Ministry on the second day of the countdown. She smiled during the ceremony. It appeared genuine. She asked me about a Cathari poet whose work she had been reading and offered an interpretation that was more insightful than most Cathari literary critics could manage. The Council interpreted this extraordinary calm in 2 ways. The optimists believed the humans were preparing a diplomatic counter-strategy, perhaps seeking private mediation channels, or assembling a coalition behind closed doors. The pessimists believed the humans were paralyzed, overwhelmed by a threat they had no capacity to address, and were maintaining normalcy as a face-saving measure, while their government scrambled for options. Both camps agreed that the 72-hour ultimatum had been a bluff, a dramatic gesture to buy time, while Hargrove's government figured out its actual response. I was not so sure. I had watched Hargrove's eyes when she delivered that statement. There was no desperation in them, no performance. I had seen bluffs before. Every diplomat who has served more than a few years learns to recognize the particular quality of a statement that sounds strong but comes from a position of weakness. Bluffs have a slight vibration to them, a tension in the voice, a brightness in the eyes that speaks of hope rather than certainty. What I saw in Hargrove's expression was something else entirely. It took me 2 days of quiet observation to find the right word for it. Finality. The 72 hours expired at 14 o'clock Council Standard Time. At 14 o'clock, measured to the second across every time zone in the galactic network, every human embassy, consulate, trade office, communication relay, and diplomatic outpost went dark. Simultaneously. Not one by one. Not in a cascade that rippled outward from some central command. All at once, as if someone had flipped a single switch that controlled every point of human presence outside their own borders. I stared at my console. The diplomatic map of the galaxy, which had shown hundreds of active human nodes moments before, was blank. The communication channels I used daily to coordinate with human trade partners returned silence. The Cultural Exchange Office, 3 levels below my suite, which I had walked past that morning and seen staffed with cheerful human coordinators sharing pastries with Cathari interns, was empty. Not closed. Empty. They were simply gone, as if they had never been there. As if the warmth and laughter I had heard through the open door that morning had been a recording that someone had finally switched off. The last message transmitted automatically from every human outpost was identical, arriving at every council member's terminal in the same instant. I read it 3 times, each reading slower than the last. Diplomatic channels closed. Stand by for resolution. The amphitheater, which had been buzzing with 100 simultaneous conversations, went silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that falls when every person in a room simultaneously realizes that something has changed in a way they do not yet understand but instinctively fear. I looked around at the faces of my fellow diplomats, beings I had known for decades, representatives of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. They wore the same expression, confusion giving way to something colder. Nobody knew what was coming, but we all knew it was coming. I logged the time in my personal record and noted, with a precision that would later feel prophetic, the humans have stopped talking. In 30 years of observing their species, this is the first time I have known them to stop talking. I find myself unable to decide whether this silence is more frightening than anything they could have said. I closed my console and sat in the dark chamber, listening to the absence of human voices, and waited. The first 6 hours after the human withdrawal were dominated by confusion and the particular kind of chaos that erupts when powerful beings realize they do not understand what is happening. Delegates argued in corridor huddles about what the simultaneous shutdown meant. Was it a protest? A dramatic but ultimately symbolic gesture meant to galvanize council support? Was it a defensive posture, a pulling in of resources before an expected counterattack? Had the humans simply recalled their personnel out of an abundance of caution, pulling their people to safety before the Draxari could threaten them as leverage? A dozen theories circulated through the council corridors, each more speculative than the last, and none of them satisfying because none of them explained the precision, the simultaneity, the completeness. Embassies did not close in perfect synchronization by accident. That required planning. The Draxari celebrated. Kresic broadcast another address, shorter this time, declaring that the humans had revealed their true nature by fleeing from confrontation. He called it validation of everything the Dominion believed about soft species. He called it proof that civilizations built on trade and diplomacy would always fold when confronted by warriors. He predicted that the humans would return to the negotiating table within days, humbled and ready to accept whatever terms he chose to impose. His officers cheered. His fleet at Meridian's Reach fired ceremonial volleys, streaks of superheated plasma lighting up the colony's sky in what was meant as a display of dominance. On the ground, Draxari soldiers raised victory banners in the colony's central square. That confidence lasted approximately 6 hours. I was in my office reviewing intelligence summaries when Taryn, my senior analyst, entered without knocking. Taryn was Cathari like me, but younger, sharper, and possessed of a nervous energy that I had always found slightly exhausting in routine briefings. She was not nervous now. She was pale. Her scales, which normally carried a healthy blue-green sheen, had gone almost gray, and her hands were trembling slightly as she placed a data tablet on my desk. "The Draxari are losing their communications network," she said. I picked up the tablet and read. Across the Draxari Dominion, military communication channels were fragmenting. Encrypted relay stations that had operated flawlessly for decades were producing garbled output. Ship-to-ship transmissions were being interrupted by ghost signals, phantom orders that appeared to originate from legitimate command sources but contained contradictory instructions. A convoy commander near the Draxari border received simultaneous orders to advance, retreat, and hold position, all bearing authentic encryption signatures. A defense station in the Krexan system reported receiving a full fleet deployment command that, when traced, appeared to come from Krezik's flagship but contained tactical parameters that contradicted everything the warlord had ever ordered. A supply convoy en route to Meridian's Reach had received navigational corrections from what appeared to be Draxari Fleet Command. The corrections were wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not obviously wrong. Wrong by fractions of a decimal point. Adjustments so subtle that the navigation officers accepted them without question. The convoy dropped out of transit in empty space, 2 light-years from its intended destination, surrounded by nothing but cold vacuum and distant stars. By the time they recalculated and resumed course, they had lost 14 hours. The troops and equipment they were carrying would not arrive when expected. Schedules would cascade, plans would unravel. "This is not random degradation," Taryn said, pulling a chair across from my desk and sitting down uninvited, which she had never done before, and which told me more about her state of mind than any words could. Someone is inside their systems, deep inside. Root-level access to their encryption architecture, their routing protocols, their authentication systems. This is not a hack. This is ownership. I scrolled through more reports. Navigation databases on Draxari warships were showing micro-corruptions. Star positions shifted by thousandths of a degree. Transit calculations off by fractions that would be invisible to standard verification but would accumulate over distance, sending ships to coordinates that were close to their targets but not close enough. Targeting systems were producing inconsistent calibration data, which meant that even if a Draxari gunner had a human ship in their sights, their weapons might fire slightly off-axis. Maintenance schedules were being altered in fleet management systems, causing crews to perform unnecessary overhauls on functioning equipment while genuinely faulty components went unaddressed, building toward cascading mechanical failures. Each individual error was small, trivial even, in isolation. The cumulative effect was that the entire Draxari military machine was beginning to stumble, like a powerful animal whose nervous system was being slowly, methodically disconnected from its muscles. "What about their civilian infrastructure?" I asked. Taryn brought up a second display, her expression darkening further. The Draxari financial network, a complex web of interstellar credit systems and trade agreements that undergirded the Dominion's economy, had crashed. Not slowly, not in a gradual decline that economists could track and potentially arrest. It had collapsed in a single cascading failure that began in their central banking servers and propagated outward at the speed of light relay transmission. The Dominion Krenin, their currency, had become functionally worthless on the Galactic exchange within hours. Credit systems that funded military supply contracts failed when payment verification servers returned errors. Suppliers who had been filling procurement orders canceled shipments automatically when their payment guarantees evaporated. Insurance networks that covered military logistics reported systemic data corruption and froze all accounts pending audit. The civilian economy was seizing up, not because of any direct attack on civilian targets, but because the financial architecture that supported everything had simply stopped working. I set the tablet down and looked at Taryn. "How?" I asked. She leaned forward. "Ambassador, the level of access required to do what they are doing, the depth of penetration into Draxari military and financial systems, means the humans have been inside these networks for years, maybe decades. Every communication protocol, every encryption standard, every financial routing algorithm. They know it all. They mapped every node, every backup system, every failover. They probably helped design parts of it." She paused. "Do you remember the technology exchange program 6 years ago, when the humans offered to help the Draxari modernize their banking infrastructure? It was celebrated as a diplomatic breakthrough. Hargrove hosted a dinner. You were there." I remembered. I remembered the speeches about cooperation. I remembered Hargrove toasting to friendship between species. I remembered thinking how remarkable it was that the humans could find common ground even with the Draxari. "They were building the door they are now walking through," Taryn said quietly. I sat with that for a long moment. The implications were enormous, and they extended far beyond the Draxari. If the humans had been building intelligence access points through their aid programs and trade agreements, then every species that had accepted human help was potentially compromised. Every hospital, every agricultural project, every financial modernization initiative, every cultural exchange that sent bright, friendly, curious human students to live among alien populations and learn their systems from the inside. The warmth was real, perhaps. The generosity was genuine, perhaps. But underneath it, or alongside it, or woven through it, in a way I could not yet fully comprehend, there was something else. Something patient. Something that watched and cataloged and prepared for a day that the humans hoped would never come, but built for anyway. Preparation. On the 5th day, small human vessels began appearing in Draxari space. They were not warships by any recognizable standard. Terran's team classified them as fast deployment platforms, sensor-stealthy craft no larger than a standard courier shuttle, moving at speeds that our tracking systems struggled to register. They appeared at the edges of Draxari systems, deployed something that sensors could not identify, and vanished before Draxari weapons could establish a targeting solution. The deployments lasted seconds. The effects lasted much longer. In the hours after each appearance, something in the target system would fail. A fuel depot would malfunction, its containment systems venting reserves into space in controlled bursts that emptied the tanks without causing explosions that might endanger nearby civilian structures. A shipyard's automation network would lock out its operators, freezing production lines mid-assembly with precision that suggested intimate knowledge of the software architecture. A fleet staging area would lose its navigation beacon, leaving dozens of ships unable to form up for coordinated action. The Draxari were firing at shadows. Their guns tracked targets that were no longer there. Their interceptors chased sensor ghosts into empty space, burning fuel and accumulating wear on engines that maintenance schedules were no longer properly tracking. Their commanders issued orders that arrived garbled, late, or not at all. I watched the intelligence feeds and saw an empire beginning to unravel, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. The humans were not attacking the Draxari military. They were attacking the systems that allowed the military to function: communications, logistics, finance, data integrity, navigation, everything a fighting force needed except the weapons themselves. It was as if someone had decided to defeat an army not by meeting it on the battlefield, but by removing the battlefield entirely, leaving 1,000 warships with loaded weapons and nowhere to point them and no way to coordinate their fire. On the 6th day, a Draxari general named Vorith appeared before the council in an extraordinary breach of protocol. He had not been invited. He had not requested the floor. He simply walked into the amphitheater during a session on trade tariffs, his uniform disheveled, his armored hide dull with stress, and began speaking. His voice was raw, with something that took me a moment to identify as desperation. He begged for mediation. His words tumbled out in disjointed bursts, stripped of the formal cadence that Draxari military officers were trained to maintain at all times. They could not find the human fleet. There was no fleet to find. There were only these ghosts, these small, fast ships that appeared and vanished like smoke before weapons could lock. They could not coordinate a military response because their communications were compromised at every level. Encrypted channels that had been secure for decades were producing phantom traffic. Orders sent from command reached subordinates garbled or altered. They could not resupply because their logistics network was paralyzed, convoys arriving at wrong coordinates or not arriving at all. They could not pay their soldiers because their financial system was dead. Troops on garrison worlds were beginning to wonder when they would be paid, fed, and rotated. And the answers were not coming because the systems that generated answers had stopped functioning. The war was 6 days old, Vorith said, and the Draxari had not fired a single shot at a confirmed human target. Not one. Because there were no confirmed human targets. They were fighting an enemy that did not exist in any form they knew how to engage. Vorith looked broken. Not defeated in the way a warrior looks after losing a battle. Not angry or defiant or grieving. Broken in the way an engineer looks when a machine they trusted completely has started operating in ways they cannot explain. His certainty, the bedrock Draxari confidence in military supremacy that had sustained his species for 400 years, had cracked. And through the crack, poured something cold and disorienting. The council dispatched a diplomatic shuttle to human space. It was received politely. The shuttle landed at a human station, and the delegation was escorted through clean corridors by courteous staff to a meeting room where Director Hargrove sat waiting, looking exactly as she had when she delivered her ultimatum, composed, patient, final. The head of the delegation, a Valesi senior mediator named Prelith, presented a ceasefire proposal. Standard terms: mutual withdrawal of forces, neutral arbitration of territorial claims, restoration of diplomatic channels, confidence-building measures. It was the kind of framework that had resolved dozens of conflicts in galactic history, and Prelith presented it with the polished expertise of a career diplomat who had mediated 7 major disputes. Hargrove declined. Prelith pressed. He spoke about galactic stability, about precedent, about the responsibility of major powers to resolve disputes through dialogue rather than unilateral action. He invoked historical examples. He cited council charter provisions. He was eloquent and sincere. He believed, genuinely believed, that every conflict could be resolved through dialogue, and he brought every tool in his considerable arsenal to bear. Hargrove listened to every word with the courteous attention she brought to every interaction. She did not interrupt. She did not dismiss. When Prelith finished, she spoke a single sentence that the mediator later repeated to me verbatim, his voice barely above a whisper, his hands gripping a teacup he had not drunk from. "We warned them. We do not fight wars, Ambassador. Wars imply both sides are participating." She then thanked the delegation for their concern, expressed genuine appreciation for their commitment to peace, escorted them to their shuttle with the same warm hospitality she had shown during the meeting, and closed the channel. The delegation returned to the council in silence. Prelith went directly to his quarters and did not emerge for 14 hours. When he did emerge, he looked like he had aged a decade. I spent that night in my office, alone with my thoughts and the faint hum of the Citadel's life support. I pulled up every interaction I had ever had with a human diplomat and reviewed them one by one. The trade negotiations where they cheerfully accepted terms that seemed slightly unfavorable, never pushing too hard, always finding the middle ground. The cultural programs where they sent their brightest young people to live among alien species, learning languages, customs, and habits with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsessive. The medical missions where human doctors worked in Cathari frontier hospitals for months at a time, treating patients and building relationships with local officials who controlled infrastructure access. The joint scientific expeditions where human researchers worked alongside Drexari academics, sharing laboratory space and data and meals. I had always interpreted these interactions as the behavior of a genuinely friendly species, naive perhaps, idealistic, the kind of civilization that believed cooperation was its own reward, and that building bridges was inherently superior to building weapons. I still believed that interpretation was partly true. The humans I had known were warm, their curiosity was real, their generosity was real. The doctor who had saved my nephew's life on a Cathari border world had done it because she cared, not because she was following orders. I believed that. But I was now forced to consider a second interpretation layered beneath the first, not replacing it, but coexisting with it, in a way that made my stomach tighten. Every friendly interaction was also a data point. Every exchange program was also a mapping operation. Every hospital was also a listening post. Every joint expedition was also a surveillance mission. The humans had built the most comprehensive intelligence network in galactic history, and they had built it out of kindness. Or alongside kindness. Or through kindness. The grammar did not matter. The result was the same. I did not know which version frightened me more. A species that pretended to be kind in order to spy would be dangerous but comprehensible. A species that was genuinely kind and simultaneously building the most thorough surveillance apparatus in history was something else entirely. Something I did not have a framework for. Something that suggested a depth of strategic patience that made the Drexari look like impulsive children by comparison. I closed my files and sat in the dark. And for the first time in decades of galactic diplomacy, I felt something I thought my career had burned out of me long ago. Genuine fear. Not of the Drexari, of the humans. And I was not sure the fear was rational, and I was not sure it was irrational, and that uncertainty was the most disturbing part of all. The transition between what Terran called the ghost phase and what came next happened without warning, without announcement, without the customary declarations of intent that military tradition across 100 species considered fundamental. One moment, the Drexari were struggling with crippled infrastructure, chasing phantom signals across their own territory, and watching their economy collapse in slow motion. The next moment, the sky above every Drexari military installation in the Dominion filled with ships. Real ships. Human warships. They emerged from transit corridors that no Council intelligence agency had ever detected, not even as theoretical possibilities. Terran later confirmed what the analysts had suspected but could not prove. Over the preceding 2 decades, while participating in joint astronomical surveys, and sharing navigational data with every willing species, the humans had simultaneously constructed a network of classified transit routes, threading through uncharted space. These corridors bypassed every known shipping lane, every surveillance grid, every sensor network that the Council maintained. They had built highways to war in total secrecy, and they had done it while smiling at trade conferences, sharing agricultural data, and accepting slightly unfavorable terms in negotiations that their counterparts interpreted as naivety. The fleet was not as large as the Draxari had expected. Council estimates had predicted that if humans ever fielded their full navy, it would number perhaps 4,000 vessels. The fleet that appeared numbered closer to 6,000, which meant the intelligence estimates had been wrong by 50%. But size was not what silenced the amphitheater when the sensor data came through. It was the technology. The ships were wrong. Wrong in the way that a predator disguised as prey is wrong when it finally drops the disguise. Their hull geometries did not match any known human vessel class. Their drive signatures operated at energy levels that our best physicists said should produce catastrophic containment failures, but clearly did not. Their sensor arrays scanned at ranges that Terran's team calculated should not be physically possible, given current understanding of signal propagation. And their weapons were unknown. Not upgraded versions of familiar systems. Not modifications of standard galactic armaments. Unknown, new, something the humans had developed in complete secrecy, tested in facilities that no one had ever detected, and deployed for the first time against an enemy that had never imagined such capabilities existed. What happened next took 11 minutes to begin and 7 days to complete, and it was the most precisely coordinated military operation in recorded galactic history. The humans did not attack cities. They did not bomb population centers. They did not blockade civilian trade routes or target food production facilities or water infrastructure or power grids. They hit military targets, exclusively, but they hit every military target in the Draxari Dominion simultaneously. Every shipyard, every orbital defense platform, every weapons manufacturing plant, every munitions depot, every command center, every military communications hub, every fleet staging area, every research facility producing weapons technology, every training base, every recruitment center, every military logistics warehouse. Hundreds of targets across dozens of star systems, struck in a coordinated wave so precise that Terran's team, analyzing the data afterward with the obsessive thoroughness of analysts who could not quite believe what they were seeing, determined that the timing variance between the first strike and the last was less than 4 seconds. 4 seconds. Cross an empire that spanned 47 star systems and covered a volume of space that light itself needed years to cross. The Council intelligence community spent the following weeks trying to understand how such coordination was possible. The answer, when it emerged through painstaking analysis and a few carefully worded human press releases, was both simple and terrifying. The humans had been planning this specific operation for years, not as a contingency buried in some military archive, not as an abstract scenario in a war college textbook, as a living, continuously updated battle plan that incorporated real-time intelligence from every source they had spent 3 decades cultivating. They knew the shift schedules of orbital defense stations. They knew which shipyards were producing which class of vessel and how far along each hull was in the construction process. They had the personal communication frequencies of fleet admirals, which meant they could predict command responses. They knew the security rotation patterns of munitions depots, which meant they could time strikes to coincide with shift changes when alertness was lowest. They knew the maintenance cycles of planetary defense grids, which meant they could identify windows when specific weapons were offline for servicing. Everything. Every human trade delegation that had visited a Draxari world had mapped military installations from their hotel windows. Every cultural exchange student who had lived among the Draxari had noted the locations of communications relays, memorized the patrol routes of military vehicles, cataloged the insignia of units stationed nearby. Every medical aid worker who treated Draxari patients in frontier hospitals had observed troop movements and supply routes while making house calls in communities adjacent to military bases. The intelligence was granular, comprehensive, and current. The friendly, generous, slightly naive humans that the galaxy thought it knew, had been preparing for this possibility from the day they first made contact with the wider galactic community. And they had never let a single piece of that preparation become visible. Not one data point. Not one careless conversation. Not one suspicious behavior that triggered review by Draxari counterintelligence or council monitoring systems. The discipline required for that level of operational security, sustained across an entire civilization for 3 decades, was itself a kind of weapon. I watched the Draxari battle fleet die, not from the amphitheater, not through second-hand intelligence reports, but through a council observation drone deployed to monitor the conflict under galactic law. The feed was relayed to my office in real time, and I sat at my desk with Terran standing behind me, both of us watching in silence, as the largest fleet in the sector was systematically taken apart. The Draxari fleet at Meridian's Reach numbered over 12,000 warships. It was the largest concentration of military force in the sector, assembled over a week of confident reinforcement, while the humans did nothing visible. Those 12,000 ships were not engaged in pitched battle. They were hunted. There was no other word for it. Human strike groups, operating in units of 5 to 15 vessels, swept through the Draxari formation like predators moving through a herd. They cut off clusters of ships, isolated individual vessels, jammed communications between units that tried to coordinate, and systematically disabled or destroyed every warship in the system. Ships that broadcast surrender codes were treated with mechanical precision. Human vessels closed to weapons range, fired targeted pulses that Terran later explained were designed to fuse drive cores and disable weapon systems without breaching the hull, and then moved on to the next target without pause. The surrendering ships were left drifting, powerless but intact, their crews alive and unharmed. Recovery beacons were activated automatically. Life support continued to function. Ships that did not surrender were destroyed so completely that the debris field barely registered on long-range sensors. The weapons the humans used left almost nothing behind. No wreckage to recover, no flight recorders to analyze, no evidence of the specific mechanisms that had reduced a warship to atoms. Just empty space where a vessel had been, and a fading energy signature that our instruments could not fully classify. Through the drone feed, I watched a specific engagement that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. A Draxari battle group of 80 warships under the command of a veteran admiral named Drexus formed a defensive formation near the colony's third moon. It was a textbook deployment, well positioned against the moon's gravitational shadow, fields of fire overlapping, smaller ships screening larger capitals. Drexus was one of the Dominion's most experienced commanders, a career officer with 40 years of service and a reputation for tactical adaptability. His formation was as good as Draxari doctrine could produce. A human strike force of 9 vessels approached from 3 vectors. 9 ships against 80. The Draxari outnumbered the humans nearly 9 to 1. In any conventional engagement model, those numbers were decisive. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. 43 Draxari ships broadcast surrender codes within the first 4 minutes. Not from cowardice, from comprehension. When the human weapons began firing and the captains saw what was happening to the ships around them, saw hulls that had withstood decades of combat dissolve under weapons that their sensors could not even properly classify, they understood. Some things are not battles. Some things are announcements. The remaining 37 ships held formation and fought. Admiral Drexus was among them. I watched his flagship fire everything it had at the nearest human vessel. A sleek craft perhaps 1/5 the mass of the Draxari battleship. Plasma cannons, kinetic accelerators, guided munitions. Every weapon in the Draxari arsenal struck the human ship in a sustained barrage that should have overwhelmed any known defensive system. The human ship did not appear to notice. 11 minutes after the engagement began, it was over. 43 Draxari ships drifted in surrender, powerless but alive. Of the 37 that fought, nothing remained. Not debris, not wreckage, nothing. Admiral Drexus, and every soul under his command in those 37 ships were gone. The 9 human vessels moved on to their next target without pausing. They were undamaged. I turned off the feed. I sat in my office for a long time. Terran eventually left without speaking. I think she understood that there were no words adequate to what we had just witnessed. The council fractured. Emergency sessions ran continuously. but they had devolved from coordinated governance into barely contained panic. The species that had been bullied, extorted, or conquered by the Draxari over the centuries watched the destruction with expressions ranging from grim satisfaction to barely concealed relief. The Methani delegation, whose homeworld had lived under Draxari economic domination for 80 years, was openly weeping. But others were terrified, not of the Draxari, of what was replacing them at the top of the galactic power hierarchy. The Valesi ambassador, Zeleth, requested a closed-door session with the heads of all major delegations. I attended. Zeleth stood at the center of the room and asked the question that everyone had been thinking, but no one had been willing to say aloud. If the humans can do this to the Draxari, what could they do to us? Nobody answered. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, and then stretched further. Zeleth pressed. She pointed out that the Draxari had the largest fleet in the sector, the strongest defenses, the deepest military infrastructure, and the humans were dismantling it in days, not weeks, not months, days. If this level of capability had been hidden for 32 years, what else was hidden? A Hadron military analyst named Draven presented projections that silenced the room in a different way, a heavier way, a way that settled into bones and stayed there. Based on the observed capabilities of human warships, their demonstrated coordination capacity, and the scope of their intelligence network, his models suggested that the humans could simultaneously dismantle the military infrastructure of any 3 council-member species while maintaining full defensive coverage of their own territory. Any 3. Simultaneously. The room sat with that number. It did not get more comfortable with time. I spent the following days documenting the scope of the operation, because documentation was the only response within my power, the only way I could process what I was witnessing. The numbers were staggering. The Draxari Dominion had invested 4 centuries in building its military machine, 400 years of shipyards and training academies and weapons research and fleet construction and strategic doctrine. It was the foundation of their civilization, the engine that drove their economy, the source of their identity as a species. The humans were dismantling it in days. Every hour brought reports of another cluster of shipyards going dark, another fleet element surrendering or being erased, another planetary defense grid falling silent. The most powerful military force in the sector was being taken apart with the methodical precision of a technician disassembling a malfunctioning machine, component by component, without haste, without waste, without a single wasted shot or unnecessary maneuver. But what kept me awake during those long nights was not the power. Power was comprehensible. The Draxari had power. The Valesi had power. Every major species invested in military capability to some degree. What was incomprehensible about the humans was the restraint. They could have used this capability at any point in the previous 3 decades. Against the Valesi, who had cheated them in a major trade dispute 9 years ago and cost their economy billions. Against the Rathani, who had detained human citizens on fraudulent charges. Against the Methani pirates who raided human shipping lanes. Against anyone who gave them sufficient cause. They never did. They waited. They watched. They mapped and planned and built their secret transit corridors and their hidden fleet, and they waited for decades. They waited until someone committed an act so unambiguous, so clearly beyond whatever line the humans had drawn in their own minds, that the response could not be questioned. 14 million civilians under bombardment. That was the line. And the only thing more frightening than an enemy with this kind of power was an enemy with this kind of power, and the discipline to wait decades for a reason to use it. Because discipline implied rules, rules implied a code, and a code implied that as long as you did not violate it, the most dangerous civilization in the galaxy would continue to be your friendly, generous, curious neighbor who built hospitals and sent their children to learn your language. But if you crossed the line, there would be no warning, no build-up, no escalation. There would be silence, and then there would be erasure. I wrote one line in my personal log that night, and found I could not add anything to it. They are not a military power that practices diplomacy. They are a diplomatic power that has perfected the art of ending things. Human ground forces landed on Draxari worlds on the 8th day. I had expected occupation. Every species in the Council had a framework for understanding military occupation. Because it was a recurring pattern in galactic history. Troops in the streets, curfews, checkpoints, civilian disarmament, the imagery of conquest, the daily indignities that reminded a defeated population of their new subordinate status. I expected the humans to be more civilized about it than most, perhaps, given their reputation. More polite, more restrained. But I expected the fundamental pattern to hold, because the pattern always held. Victors occupied, losers endured. What I saw through the intelligence feeds was something I had no framework for. Human soldiers moved through Draxari military installations with mechanical efficiency. They were professional, calm, and fast. Teams of specialists entered each facility in coordinated groups, securing perimeters, cataloging every weapon, every piece of military hardware, every vehicle and ammunition store with scanner systems that compiled real-time inventories. Equipment was either packaged for confiscation and removal, or destroyed in place using controlled methods that left surrounding structures undamaged. Military academies were shut down, training facilities were sealed, defense networks were permanently deactivated, their hardware removed and their software erased beyond any possibility of recovery. The soldiers did not enter civilian areas unless those areas contained concealed military assets, which they located with an accuracy that suggested their intelligence maps were precise, down to individual rooms. They did not impose curfews, they did not seize civilian government buildings, or replace local administrators. They did not restrict civilian movement or communication. They moved through the military infrastructure of the Draxari Dominion, like surgeons removing a tumor, cutting precisely along the boundary between military and civilian tissue, and leaving everything on the civilian side untouched and functioning. The Draxari military command cast was arrested on the 9th day, all of them. Warlord Krezik, his senior generals, fleet admirals, intelligence chiefs, logistics commanders. Not executed, not disappeared into unmarked detention, not paraded through streets for public humiliation. Arrested, formally, by human military police who presented identification, read specific charges from prepared documents, and escorted prisoners to secure transport with a level of procedural correctness that seemed almost absurd, given the scale of what was happening. The charges were specific and documented. The unprovoked assault on Meridian's Reach, the bombardment of civilian population centers that constituted protected zones under Galactic Convention, the deaths of 843 colonists in the initial attack, the targeting of medical facilities, the refusal of the 72-hour ultimatum. Each charge was supported by sensor recordings, communication intercepts, and physical evidence. Each prisoner was assigned a defense advocate, a human legal professional whose explicit job was to argue on behalf of their client. The humans intended to try them, in a court, with evidence and defense advocates and procedural protections, and a presumption of innocence that would be tested against the evidence and nothing else. I discussed this with Terran over cold tea in my office, and found myself unable to decide whether it made the humans more or less frightening. An enemy that conquered and executed was terrible, but comprehensible. Brutality had a logic that every species understood. An enemy that conquered, and then built a courtroom, was something else. It suggested a species that had thought so deeply about the aftermath of violence, about what came after the guns fell silent, that they had developed entire institutional frameworks for processing the destruction of an empire through legal channels. They had lawyers ready, judges selected, facilities constructed, rules of evidence drafted, all of it prepared in advance, waiting for the day it would be needed. They had built the courtroom before they built the weapons, or perhaps at the same time. I was not sure which possibility was more unsettling. On the 10th day, the Council dispatched an observer mission to a Draxari core world. I volunteered immediately. I needed to see it with my own eyes, because my imagination was filling the gaps in the intelligence reports with horrors that might not match reality, and I had learned long ago that reality, even terrible reality, was more useful than imagination. The shuttle descended through the atmosphere of Draxar Prime, the homeworld, the seat of 4 centuries of imperial power. I pressed my face against the viewport as we dropped through cloud layers and looked for the signs I expected to see. Burning buildings, rubble, the scars of orbital bombardment that marked every conquered world in galactic history, columns of refugees, smoke on the horizon. I saw none of it. The city below was intact, undamaged. Traffic moved through the streets in orderly patterns. Markets were open. People moved along sidewalks with the slightly dazed quality of someone who has experienced something enormous, but has not yet fully processed it. But they were moving. They were going about their lives. We landed at a civilian spaceport that was operating normally. Human military personnel were present, but not dominant. They stood at key intersections, armed but relaxed, directing traffic and answering questions from Draxari civilians, who approached them with the cautious curiosity of people encountering something they did not know how to categorize. I watched a human soldier help an elderly Draxari woman carry her market purchases to her transport. He was patient and gentle, and when she thanked him, he smiled and said something in passable Draxari that made her laugh. I could not hear what he said, but the laugh was real. I spent 3 days on Draxar Prime. I visited 4 cities. I spoke with civilians, local administrators, academics, shopkeepers, and several Draxari intellectuals who had been quietly opposed to the military caste for years, but had never been able to say so publicly, because dissent was not tolerated in the Dominion. What I found defied every expectation. The civilian infrastructure was untouched, not damaged and repaired, not rebuilt, untouched. The humans had managed to conduct a comprehensive military operation across an entire planet, without disrupting electrical grids, water systems, food distribution networks, or communication services. Hospitals were functioning, supplemented by human medical teams that had arrived with equipment and supplies within hours of the military operation concluding. Schools were open. Courts were in session. Local government was operating under its existing civilian leadership, which the humans had made no effort whatsoever to replace. But the military was gone. Every trace of it. The great military academies where Draxari officers had trained for generations stood empty, their gates sealed, their training grounds silent. The weapons factories that had produced warships and armaments for 4 centuries were hollow shells, their machinery removed with surgical precision, their floors swept clean. The orbital defense platforms that had ringed the planet were dark, their weapons dismounted, their crews evacuated safely to the surface. The barracks, the parade grounds, the recruitment centers, the propaganda offices, the strategic planning facilities, the intelligence headquarters, the entire vast apparatus of organized military power that had defined Draxari civilization for 400 years was simply absent. It was as if someone had reached into the body of a civilization and surgically removed a single organ, the capacity for organized violence, while leaving every other system alive and functioning. I stood in the courtyard of what had been the Imperial Military Academy, the most prestigious institution in the Dominion, and looked at the empty buildings. Wind moved through corridors that had echoed with marching feet for centuries. Training equipment stood in rows, waiting for students who would never come. It was not destruction. It was amputation. Clean, precise, and absolute. The economic stabilization surprised me most. I had expected collapse, a civilization whose identity and economy had been built around military power, suddenly stripped of that power, should have fallen into chaos. Unemployment alone should have been catastrophic, with millions of soldiers, engineers, administrators, and support workers suddenly without purpose. But the humans had anticipated this with the same thoroughness they had brought to every other aspect of the operation. Within hours of the military operations concluding, human economic teams arrived with stabilization frameworks that had clearly been developed in advance. Emergency currency systems replaced the dead kren. Supply chains were rerouted through human-facilitated networks that connected Draxari producers directly to galactic markets. Employment programs absorbed displaced military workers, redirecting them toward civilian construction, infrastructure maintenance, agricultural development, and manufacturing. The transition was not seamless, but it was functional, and it was happening faster than anyone had predicted, because the humans had been planning it for as long as they had been planning the military campaign. On my last day on Draxar Prime, I requested a private audience with Director Hargrove. She was on the planet personally, overseeing the transition from a modest office in a civilian government building. No palace, no commandeered mansion, a working office with functional furniture, and a window that looked out onto a public park where Draxari children were playing. She welcomed me with the same warmth she had always shown. She offered Cathari tea, which she had somehow acquired on a planet that did not grow it, and we sat across from each other at her desk. She looked tired, not triumphant, not satisfied, tired. The kind of tiredness that comes from doing something enormous, and difficult, and necessary, and taking no pleasure in any of it. I asked her the question that had been consuming me since the first day of the conflict. Why so absolute? The Draxari had attacked one colony. 14 million people, yes. A terrible act, certainly. But the response had dismantled the entire military identity of a 400-year-old civilization. Was this proportional? Was this just? Hargrove did not flinch. She set down her tea and spoke carefully, as though she had been expecting this question and had prepared her answer over a long period of reflection. Ambassador Viren, humanity learned something about war from our own history. We spent centuries fighting each other. Thousands of wars, millions of dead, and every war ended the same way. A treaty, reparations, terms that the victors considered generous, and the losers experienced as humiliation, resentment that built and built in the decades that followed. And then 20 or 30 years later, the next war. Bigger, worse, more destructive. Because the machinery of war had been left intact, and the grievances had been given time to ferment. We tried every variation. Harsh terms, generous terms, occupation, liberation, partnership, punishment, forgiveness. None of it worked. Because every approach left the fundamental capacity intact. Half measures are just delayed violence, Ambassador. The only wars in human history that ever truly ended were the ones where one side lost not the will to fight, but the physical capacity to fight again. Not temporarily, permanently. She gestured toward the window, where children were climbing on a piece of playground equipment that I realized, with a start, had been installed by human engineers within the past week. The Draxari will recover. Their culture will survive. Their art, their philosophy, their cuisine, their family structures, their scientific traditions, all of it will endure. What we removed was the machine. In a generation, they will build a new identity. One not centered on military dominance. They will be traders, scientists, explorers perhaps, maybe even allies. But they will never again have the ability to assemble a fleet and rain fire on 14 million civilians. That capacity is gone, permanently. I asked if this did not make humanity the very thing it claimed to oppose. A dominant military power imposing its will on others. The galaxy's enforcer, answerable to no one, deciding which species could have weapons and which could not. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was lower, and for the first time I heard something in it that might have been pain. The difference, Ambassador, is that we do not want to do this. We never wanted to. We spent 32 years hoping we would never have to activate any of the contingencies we built. Every hospital we built on your border worlds was a genuine gift. Every cultural exchange was a genuine connection. We meant every handshake. But someone has to be willing to end it permanently, or it never ends. Someone has to be the species that says, clearly and without ambiguity, that there is a line, and crossing it does not lead to war. It leads to the end of your ability to wage war, ever. She picked up her tea again. We will accept being feared for that. We would rather be feared and have the galaxy at peace than be loved and watch another 14 million people die because we were too gentle to do what was necessary. I left her office and walked through the streets of the Draxari capital as evening fell. The city was quiet, but not oppressed. People moved through the streets with the cautious normalcy of a population adjusting to a new reality. A restaurant was open on a corner, warm light spilling through its windows, and inside, I could see Draxari families eating dinner. A group of young Draxari were sitting in a public square, talking and laughing about something I could not hear. A human patrol walked past them and nodded. The young people nodded back. It was not friendliness exactly, but it was not fear either. It was something new, something without a name yet. I calculated the timeline in my personal log that night. From the expiration of the 72-hour ultimatum to the formal disarmament of the last Draxari garrison, 11 days. 400 years of military empire, erased in 11 days. I wrote the number and stared at it for a very long time before I could bring myself to close the file. The aftermath was not a single event, but a slow transformation that unfolded over weeks and months, reshaping the landscape of galactic politics in ways that no one had fully anticipated, and that I, despite 30 years of diplomatic experience, was only beginning to understand. The immediate effect was military. Arms budgets across the Council began shrinking. Not dramatically, not with public announcements or formal policy shifts, or speeches about a new era of peace. Quietly, in the margins of appropriations documents, and the footnotes of defense reviews, and the private conversations between finance ministers, who had suddenly discovered that their constituencies were less enthusiastic about military spending than they had been 6 months ago. Species that had been building military coalitions, the Valesi Compact, the Outer Rim Alliance, the Hadron Defense Pact, dissolved them without ceremony or public acknowledgement. Border disputes that had simmered for decades, generating periodic diplomatic crises and the occasional exchange of fire, were suddenly resolved through negotiation. Territory was conceded, trade agreements were signed, long-standing grievances were addressed, with a speed and cooperativeness that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. Nobody said why, nobody had to. The Draxari erasure hung over every negotiation like an invisible weight, a reminder that somewhere in human space, behind the friendly smiles and the cultural exchanges and the shared agricultural data, there was a fleet and a doctrine and a set of contingency plans that could turn 400 years of military power into 11 days of silence. Council sessions became strange in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. Species that had previously spoken about humans with condescension, describing them as naive traders or idealistic diplomats playing at galactic politics, now used words like partner and valued ally with an eagerness that bordered on desperation. Trade agreements with human delegations became notably more generous. Territorial concessions were offered before the humans even raised the subject. Research sharing proposals that would have been debated for months sailed through committee in days. Every species wanted to be closer to the humans, or at least wanted to avoid being perceived as distant. I recognized it for what it was, not respect, fear, wearing a diplomatic smile. The galaxy had not become more cooperative because its inhabitants had experienced a moral awakening. It had become more cooperative because every species with a military budget was quietly, persistently terrified of drawing the kind of attention that the Draxari had drawn. The humans knew it too. I watched Hargrove in council sessions during the weeks that followed, accepting favorable trade terms and partnership proposals with the same gracious composure she brought to everything. But I noticed something in her expression during these interactions that had not been there before: a heaviness. When a Rathani delegation fell over themselves to offer exclusive mining rights in a disputed asteroid belt, practically begging the humans to accept terms that would have been considered insulting a year ago, Hargrove accepted with warmth and professionalism. But in the moment after the handshake, when the Rathani ambassador turned away to celebrate with his aides, I saw her face. She was not pleased. She was carrying something, and with each new display of fearful generosity, it got heavier. I followed the Draxari situation closely over the months that followed. The war crimes trials proceeded at the neutral judicial facility the humans had established. The proceedings were fair, methodical, and transparent. Every session was broadcast on open channels that any species could access. Evidence was presented in meticulous detail by prosecutors who built their cases with the careful rigor of professionals who knew the galaxy was watching. Defense advocates argued vigorously, and several made compelling cases that impressed even the Draxari civilian observers who had initially been skeptical of the process. Warlord Krezek was convicted on all charges. The evidence was overwhelming. Sensor recordings showed his flagship directing bombardment of civilian residential zones. Communication intercepts captured his direct orders to fire on medical facilities. Testimony from his own officers described his dismissal of the human ultimatum. He was sentenced to life imprisonment at a facility the humans had constructed specifically for the purpose, comfortable but permanent. He would spend the rest of his natural life in a clean, well-lit cell, with access to books and educational materials and regular medical care, which was more consideration than he had shown the 843 civilians who died under his bombardment. But others were acquitted. A fleet admiral named Travaus, who had argued against the attack on Meridian's Reach and been overruled by Krezek, was cleared of all charges. The evidence showed he had attempted to resign his commission rather than participate, and had been threatened with execution for insubordination. A logistics officer who had quietly routed supply convoys away from civilian areas, risking court-martial to minimize collateral damage, was commended for conduct under impossible circumstances. The trials were not a rubber stamp. They were a genuine judicial process, and the outcomes reflected the evidence. Draxari civilians were not punished. They were not taxed, restricted, or subjected to collective retribution of any kind. The military prohibitions were absolute, enforced by monitoring systems that the humans installed in every Draxari system, but everything beyond those prohibitions was left entirely to the Draxari themselves. Human economic aid continued flowing. Cultural exchange programs began, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm on both sides. Within 6 months, the first Draxari students enrolled in human universities, studying subjects that had been impossible under the old regime because military funding consumed every available resource. Within 8 months, a Draxari chef opened a restaurant on a human space station and was overwhelmed by customers curious about Dominion cuisine that had never been available outside Draxari borders. I interviewed a young Draxari academic named Kelith during one of my follow-up visits to Draxar Prime. She was studying xenobiology at a newly opened civilian research institute, a bright, energetic researcher whose enthusiasm for her work reminded me of the human scientists I had known. I asked her how she felt about what had happened to her civilization. She was quiet for a long time, looking out the window of the institute, at a skyline that no longer bristled with military installations and orbital defense platforms. Then she said something that lodged in my mind and has not left it since. They destroyed the thing that was destroying us. We just could not see it from the inside. She explained. The military caste had consumed Draxari society for centuries. The best minds went into weapons research instead of medicine or basic science. The strongest bodies went into combat training instead of construction or agriculture. The economy existed to feed the fleet. Art existed to glorify conquest. Education existed to produce officers. Philosophy existed to justify expansion. Every aspect of Draxari civilization had been bent toward the service of a military machine that demanded everything and gave back only the cold comfort of being feared. My grandmother was a poet, Kelith said softly. She wrote 17 collections. Nobody read them. There was no audience for poetry in a society that only valued tactical manuals and battle histories. She died believing her life's work was worthless. Kelith looked back at me. I wonder what she would think of this. I wonder if she would call it liberation. I did not have an answer for her, but I carried her words with me back to the council citadel, where they sat alongside everything else I had accumulated, and refused to settle into any comfortable conclusion. 8 months after the Draxari erasure, the equilibrium was tested. A new species entered the galactic stage. They called themselves the Vraxith Collective, and they announced their presence with the subtlety of a gravitational collapse. Their fleet materialized at the edge of council-monitored space, a substantial force of warships bristling with unfamiliar weapons, and their ambassador, a towering armored figure named Korath, addressed the council with open contempt. The Vraxith claimed sovereignty over 3 inhabited systems belonging to council member species. They threatened military action against any who challenged their claims. They dismissed the council's authority as a bureaucratic fiction maintained by species too weak to take what they wanted. And they specifically called out the humans, mocking the Draxari conflict as propaganda and exaggeration, dismissing the entire erasure as fabricated or wildly overstated. "We have studied your so-called erasure," Korath declared from the council floor, his voice dripping with calculated disdain. "We find it unconvincing. The Draxari were soft, decadent. Their empire was rotting from within, sustained only by reputation. Any halfway competent military force could have toppled them. You humans are storytellers, not warriors, and we do not frighten as easily as your previous victims." I watched the human delegation during this performance. They showed no reaction. Hargrove sat with her hands folded, her expression neutral. watching Korath with the same calm attention she had given Krezek 9 months earlier. The same stillness, the same patience, the same quality of attention that I now understood was not passivity, but assessment. The council buzzed with alarm. Here it was. Another aggressive species, another territorial claim backed by military threats, another potential conflict that could cascade into devastation. I saw genuine fear on the faces of delegates who had hoped, perhaps naively, that the Draxari erasure would prevent exactly this kind of challenge. What happened next did not happen on the council floor. It happened in intelligence channels that I had access to only because my position as senior Cathari diplomat gave me certain monitoring privileges that most delegations did not enjoy. Before sending Korath to make his defiant speech, the Vraxith High Command had done something prudent. They had requested a full intelligence briefing from their own analysts on the Draxari conflict. They wanted data, not propaganda. They wanted to understand exactly what they might be provoking. The briefing was delivered. It was thorough. It included detailed analysis of observed human weapons capabilities, with energy output calculations that their physicists described as theoretically inconsistent with known physics. It included fleet coordination methodology, with timing synchronization data that their military strategists called operationally impossible by any doctrine we understand. It included intelligence penetration depth estimates that their counterintelligence chief summarized in a single margin note: if the humans have done this to the Draxari, assume they have done it to us. It included a timeline of the 11-day erasure, annotated with tactical assessments that grew progressively more alarmed as the briefing progressed. It included the current status of the Draxari military capacity, which was a single word: non-existent. And it included a probability assessment of Vraxith survival in a similar confrontation with the humans. I obtained a copy of this assessment through channels I will not identify. It was a single page. The methodology section was extensive and rigorous. The conclusion was a single word: negligible. 2 days after the intelligence briefing was delivered to the Vraxith High Command, with Korath's defiant speech still echoing through the council chambers, and military analysts across the galaxy modeling scenarios for the next erasure, the Vraxith ambassador quietly requested a private meeting with Director Hargrove. The request was granted within the hour. The meeting took place in a small conference room adjacent to the amphitheater. It lasted 40 minutes. No transcript was produced. No observers were permitted. No recording devices were allowed. I never learned what Hargrove said to Korath during those 40 minutes. I asked her once, months later, during a social reception, approaching the question with the casual indirection that decades of diplomacy had taught me. She smiled, the warm, genuine smile that I had learned to recognize as both completely real and completely uninformative, and changed the subject with the practiced ease of someone who had been deflecting harder questions since before I knew her. But I saw the results. The following day, the Vraxith Collective publicly withdrew all territorial claims against council member species. Korath delivered a formal statement of retraction, phrased with careful diplomatic language that his speechwriters had clearly labored over. He apologized for what he termed premature assertions made without full contextual understanding of the galactic community's existing frameworks. He requested council membership under standard terms, submitting to the same obligations and restrictions that governed every other member species. He proposed a comprehensive trade agreement with human systems, offering terms so favorable that Terran initially assumed the document was a forgery. Korath delivered the withdrawal speech personally. He stood at the same podium where he had mocked the humans 24 hours earlier, and he read from his prepared statement with the careful precision of someone who has rehearsed every word multiple times and is terrified of departing from the script. He was composed and professional. He was also, to anyone who had spent decades reading alien body language, profoundly shaken. His hands, which had gestured broadly during his initial speech, were pressed flat against the podium. His voice, which had boomed with confidence, was controlled to the point of rigidity. His eyes, which had burned with contempt, were carefully, deliberately empty. When reporters asked what had prompted the change in position, he paused for a fraction of a second too long, the kind of pause that spoke volumes to anyone trained to listen, and then said, "We received better information." Hargrove was standing nearby during the press interaction. I watched her from across the room. She smiled. It did not reach her eyes. In the weeks and months that followed, I took to walking through the council citadel during the late hours, when the corridors were empty and the diplomatic machinery of galactic civilization had wound down for the night. The citadel was a different place in the dark, quieter, more honest. The ceremonial lighting dimmed to a soft glow that smoothed the edges of everything, and the silence allowed thoughts that the noise of daytime governance kept at bay. I thought about the galaxy I had known before humans arrived, chaotic, violent, full of species jockeying for advantage through military threat and the occasional application of force. Border wars flared and burned out and flared again with the regularity of seasons. Empires rose and conquered, and were eventually conquered in turn. The strong took from the weak, and the weak built strength to take it back. And the cycle continued, because there was no mechanism to break it. Diplomacy slowed the cycle. My entire career had been dedicated to slowing the cycle. But diplomacy never stopped it. It could not. As long as the machinery of war existed, and the incentives to use it remained, war would continue. It was not a failure of will or wisdom. It was a structural problem. I thought about the galaxy now. Quieter, more cautious. Disputes that would have generated military confrontations a year ago were being resolved through negotiation, not because the parties had suddenly developed a deeper appreciation for compromise, but because the alternative had been made viscerally, undeniably clear. A kind of enforced civility had settled over interstellar relations, something that sat somewhere between genuine peace and collective paralysis. I wondered if this was better. I spent many late nights wrestling with that question, turning it over, examining it from every angle my experience could provide. A peace born from fear was not the same as a peace born from mutual understanding. A galaxy that cooperated because it was terrified of what one species could do if provoked was not the same as a galaxy that cooperated because it genuinely valued cooperation. There was something hollow about it, something fragile, something that depended entirely on the continued existence and restraint of a single species, which was not a foundation that any political scientist would consider stable. But then I thought about the Draxari, not the Empire, the people. I thought about Keleth, studying xenobiology with bright eyes and irrepressible enthusiasm in an institution that could not have existed under the old regime. I thought about her grandmother, the poet whose 17 collections might finally find readers in a society no longer obsessed with conquest. I thought about the children in the park on Draxar Prime, playing on equipment that human engineers had installed, in a city that was intact and functioning and free, for the first time in 400 years, from the crushing weight of an empire that had consumed everything in service of its own military appetite. I thought about the Vraxith, who had arrived prepared for confrontation and left having chosen partnership. Not from generosity, certainly, from pragmatism, from the cold calculation that cooperation was preferable to annihilation, but partnership nonetheless. And I thought about the fact that pragmatic partnership, maintained long enough, had a way of becoming genuine. Habits become cultures, behaviors become values. A species that cooperates because it is afraid might, over generations, become a species that cooperates because it has forgotten any other way. Was it ideal? No. Was it better than the alternative? I decided, reluctantly, and with full awareness of the complexity and the compromises embedded in the conclusion, that it was, not because the humans were benevolent. I was no longer certain that any species with that kind of power could remain truly benevolent in any uncomplicated sense, but because the alternative was worse. The Draxari would have kept conquering. The Vraxith would have started wars. Dozens of species would have continued the cycle of armament and aggression that had characterized galactic civilization for millennia, and millions more would have died in conflicts that accomplished nothing except setting the stage for the next conflict. The humans did not stop the cycle by asking nicely. They stopped it by demonstrating, once and irrevocably, what waited at the end of the road. I encountered Hargrove one final time in a corridor of the Citadel, on the evening before the annual council reception. Casual, unplanned. She was walking alone, carrying a data tablet, and she looked up and smiled when she saw me. We stopped and talked. She asked about my family. She asked about my homeworld's harvest season, which she remembered from a conversation we had months ago. She asked about a Cathari novel she had been reading, one of the old classics, which she discussed with the genuine enthusiasm of someone who loved stories and wanted to understand every culture she encountered. Her questions were specific and thoughtful. She had clearly read the book carefully. For a moment, standing in that corridor with the soft light of the Citadel's evening cycle, warming the walls around us, I saw the version of humanity that the galaxy had known before. The friendly traders who negotiated in good faith, the generous doctors who saved lives in frontier hospitals, the curious diplomats who learned your language and read your literature and built hospitals on your border worlds because they believed, with an earnestness that could be mistaken for naivety, that helping others was its own justification. Then I remembered 11 days. I remembered a 400-year empire turned to silence. I remembered the 9 ships and the 80 and the 11 minutes. Both versions were the same species. The warmth was real, the capability was real, and the line between them was a 72-hour ultimatum that, once ignored, activated something that could not be stopped, bargained with, or survived. I said goodnight to Hargrove. She wished me well and told me to enjoy the reception. Her smile was warm. I believed it was genuine. I also believed that somewhere in the architecture of human military planning, there existed a file with my homeworld's name on it, a contingency that would never be activated as long as the Cathari never gave humanity a reason. And I believed that the humans who had written that file were the same humans who had built hospitals on our border, and read our poetry, and learned our language out of genuine love for what made us different. I returned to my office and recorded my final log entry on the matter. It took me several attempts to find the right words, and I am not certain I succeeded, but this is what I said. The galaxy has entered what historians will call the long quiet. Not peace exactly. Peace implies a choice freely made by all parties. This is something else. An absence of war, born from the understanding that one species has perfected the art of ending it. The weapons are real. The doctrine is real. The contingency plans, I am now certain, exist for every major military power in the Council, filed somewhere in human archives, updated continuously, waiting for a 72-hour clock that I pray never starts ticking. The humans are, without question, the most dangerous civilization the galaxy has ever produced. Their technology exceeds our understanding. Their intelligence capabilities exceed our imagination. Their capacity for coordinated, decisive, absolute action exceeds anything in recorded history. They are also, without question, the most generous, the most curious, the most stubbornly, infuriatingly, genuinely optimistic species I have ever encountered. They build hospitals, they read our literature, they learn our languages and cook our food and send their children to live among us. And they do these things not as cover for their capabilities, but alongside them. Both truths exist simultaneously, and I do not know how to reconcile them. I suspect no one ever will. They do not want war, they never did. I believe this with every fiber of my being, based on every interaction I have had with every human I have ever known. But they built themselves into the kind of ending that makes war unthinkable. Not through threats, not through posturing, through a single, devastating demonstration that left no room for doubt, no space for the comfortable fiction that perhaps the humans were bluffing, that perhaps their reach had limits, that perhaps a sufficiently bold or sufficiently clever adversary could find a way through. There is no way through. There is only the choice between cooperation and silence. The galaxy, for the first time in recorded history, is learning to talk instead of fight. Whether that makes humanity our greatest ally or our most patient threat, I cannot say with certainty. I suspect the answer is both, held in tension, neither canceling the other, a paradox that will define galactic politics for generations to come. I know only this. I am glad, deeply, quietly, profoundly glad, that the Cathari never gave them a reason. I closed the file. I turned off my console. I sat in the dark of my office, listening to the distant hum of the Citadel's life support systems and the muffled sounds of a galaxy that was, for the first time in a very long time, choosing its words carefully. And in the silence, somewhere far away, the humans were doing what they had always done. Building hospitals, reading books, learning languages, reaching out with one hand in friendship while the other rested, patient and still, on a capability that no one would ever be foolish enough to test again. The long quiet had begun, and despite everything, despite the fear and the awe and the impossible contradiction at the heart of it all, I found that I could sleep.